Chapter 1 Controlled Burn. The thing about fire on water is that there is nowhere for it to go except up. Rafael Solis had been a Coast Guard rescue swimmer for 11 years, and he had pulled people out of oil fires twice before, once in the Straits of Florida during a tanker collision, once off the coast of Louisiana after a pipeline rupture that the company had known about for 6 months before it became everyone's problem. He knew the geometry of offshore burns. He knew how the fuel spread on the surface and how the smoke column moved, and how the heat worked differently over salt water than it did over land, rising without the terrain to shape it. A pure vertical column, visible from 40 miles out. He had never seen one this size. The Copernicus platform, a semi-submersible, deepwater drilling rig operated by a Houston-based energy company, was burning from its production deck upward when the alert came in at 6:44 a.m. Not a localized fire, not an isolated blowout. A catastrophic overpressure event had triggered sequential failures across the production module, and the resulting explosion had compromised 2 of the 4 pontoon stabilizers, which meant the platform was not just burning, it was also listing, slowly but measurably, to the southeast. 63 personnel were on board. 12 had already made it to the primary life raft station. 11 more were in the water. The other 40 were unaccounted for. Rafael was in the rescue helicopter before the second transmission finished. Connor James had been awake for 22 hours when the explosion happened. That was not unusual. He was the lead petroleum engineer on the Copernicus, responsible for the drilling program and the well integrity monitoring system. And the well they'd been working for the past 6 weeks was a complicated one. High pressure, high temperature, deeper than the reservoir models had initially suggested, with a gas cap that required constant calibration to manage safely. He had been managing it. He had been managing it meticulously, with the quiet, relentless attention that had defined his work since his first offshore rotation at 24. Fresh out of Louisiana State's petroleum engineering program, learning the rigs from the roughnecks up, he had been in his bunk for exactly 40 minutes when the first concussion came. Not an alarm. The alarms came after a cascade of them. Production module first, then the blowout preventer stack, then the pontoon monitoring system showing a pressure reading that couldn't be right and was. He was moving before he registered that he was moving, pulling on his survival suit in the dark, running the route to the muster station that he had walked in his sleep for 6 weeks. The production deck was gone, not damaged, not on fire, gone, or what was left of it was fire, orange and black and pouring heat that he could feel from 40 feet away with the full survival suit on. He ran the personnel count in his head. 63 on board. He'd seen 12 at the life raft station, accounted for 11 more in the water. The math left a number he didn't want to hold. He started moving toward the secondary muster point, calling names as he went. He found 4 people in the auxiliary equipment bay, 2 roughnecks, a crane operator, and the night shift tool pusher sheltering behind a steel partition as the structure groaned and settled around them. He got them to the rail. He got them into life preservers. He watched them go into the water and pointed them toward the nearest raft. Then the catwalk behind him failed. Not all at once. One anchor point first, then the second. The whole thing, pivoting on the third and swinging, and Connor with it. One hand on the rail of the catwalk and the other on nothing. Momentum, carrying him outward and down toward the water, 14 feet below, which was also on fire, not directly below him. Not yet, but the current was moving it toward him, and the platform was still listing, and the gap between where he was and where the fire was getting smaller with every second. He held on. He had always been good at holding on. Rafael's team was the second helicopter on scene. The primary had already extracted 4 survivors from the water on the south side of the platform and was running them back to the Galveston base. Rafael's Bird Air Station, Galveston's M60 Jayhawk, pilot Lieutenant Ana Reyes, flight mechanic Petty Officer Torres came in from the northwest, away from the smoke column, which was tracking south-southeast at 30 knots in the pre-front wind. He was scanning the platform surface when Torres spotted the figure on the catwalk. Swimmer. 2 o'clock. Platform north face, east catwalk. He's hanging off the rail, Rafael assessed in real time. Platform stability was compromised. 2 pontoon failures meant unpredictable motion, surge, and sway that would complicate deployment. The fire was southeast and moving with the wind, which bought them a window. The man on the catwalk was wearing a survival suit, which meant he had thermal protection, but the suit wouldn't help him if the fire reached him or if he went into the water. On the south side, the catwalk was also visibly failing. The third anchor point, the one the whole thing was hanging from, had a stress fracture visible even at this distance, even through smoke. Deploy, Rafael said. Reyes. Wind is variable. Current is pushing fire east. Window is maybe 4 minutes. I know. He was already at the door. Keep her steady. He went in. 11 years in the water, and Rafael had never fully lost the particular clarity of a cold deployment. The shock of it. Even in a wetsuit, the way the Gulf recalibrated your nervous system, whether you wanted it to or not. He surfaced quickly, got his bearings, and swam hard for the platform base. The man on the catwalk was still there, holding on, as Rafael had been told. He was big, broad-shouldered, Irish-American by the look of him, maybe late 30s, early 40s, with red-brown hair plastered dark with sweat under his survival suit hood. His grip on the rail was white-knuckled and completely steady, like someone who had made a decision about letting go and was enforcing it consciously. Second by second, he was also looking directly at Rafael, not the way people usually looked at a rescue swimmer coming in, not with the frantic relief of someone who had been waiting to be saved. He was looking at him like he was solving a problem, reading the approach vector, calculating something. The third anchor point is cracked, the man called down. His voice was hoarse from smoke, but the enunciation was precise. I've been watching it. I'd give it 90 seconds before it fails completely. Okay, Rafael called back. He was at the platform base, scanning for the approach ladder. I'm going to come to you. Can you move toward the ladder at all? Not without putting more weight on the anchor point. I've been distributing it manually, he said. This the way an engineer explains a problem. Not complaining, just reporting. If I shift, it'll go faster. Then don't shift. Stay exactly where you are. Rafael had found the ladder corroded but attached, the lower 3 rungs still above water. He started climbing. What's your name? A beat. Like the man was surprised to be asked. Connor James. Rafael. He was at the second platform level. Now, petroleum engineer? How did you know? The way you described the anchor point. Rafael reached the catwalk level. He could see the fracture clearly now. Hairline but deep, propagating in the pattern of metal under sustained shear load. The man was right. 90 seconds was generous. You're thinking about the physics instead of the fire. Connor James looked at him. In the orange light, with smoke moving behind him and the catwalk swaying under the degraded load, his expression was not what Rafael expected from someone hanging 14 feet over burning water. It was almost focused. The expression of someone who had found the problem and was managing it, and had just been handed a new variable to incorporate. I'm always thinking about the physics, Connor said. Good, Rafael said. So am I. Here's ours. I'm going to clip to the rail beside you, and we're going to move together. Low center of gravity. Weight distributed. The fracture propagates along the vertical axis. We move horizontal, we buy time. Understood? Connor studied him for exactly 2 seconds. Understood, he said. They moved. It took 43 seconds to reach the end of the catwalk and the secondary ladder that accessed the northern pontoon level. The third anchor point failed at second 38. Rafael heard it go, felt the shudder through the structure, kept moving. At second 43, they were off the catwalk and on solid platform deck, and the catwalk was swinging free behind them, making a sound like a bell that had forgotten its purpose. Connor looked back at it, then at Rafael. 90 seconds was accurate, he said. It was, Rafael said. You did well. I held on. A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not quite past the professional management, but close to the edge of it. There were 4 people in the equipment bay. I got them to the rail, I know. We saw them go in. They made it to the rafts. Connor nodded. The nod of someone filing a piece of information that matters very much. In a place where information about people's survival was the primary currency, there are still people unaccounted for, he said. I know. Rafael had his radio out. Tell me what you know about the secondary muster locations. Where would people shelter if the primary route was blocked? Connor told him. 3 locations, detailed, precise, with structural assessments of each that were more useful than anything Rafael had heard from Platform Command. He was thinking about the people. He was thinking about the structure. He was thinking about both simultaneously, in a way that Rafael recognized from the best people he'd worked with over 11 years. They moved into the platform together, not because the plan required it, because it was the faster way. They found 7 more survivors in the next 23 minutes. A driller and 2 roughnecks sheltered in a pressure-rated storage room on deck 2. A safety officer with a broken collarbone in the stairwell between decks 3 and 4, who had been waiting with professional patience for someone to come for her. 3 more in the dive support module on the northwest face, the farthest point from the explosion, and therefore the most intact section of the platform, protected by a firewall that had done exactly what it was designed to do. Connor knew where each of them was. Not from memory. He hadn't been in all those locations during the evacuation, but from the logic of the platform's design. The same logic that had told him where to look during the initial evacuation. The geometry of a structure he had spent 6 weeks learning as thoroughly as a body. He walked Rafael through it like narrating a map he was reading in real time. By the time the last 3 emerged from the dive support module, the second rescue helicopter was on scene, and the primary had returned from its second run. The fire on the southeast face was being beaten back by foam deployment from a response vessel that had come up from Port Forkin. The list had stabilized. One of the pontoon failures had been isolated, the remaining 3 holding. The Copernicus was not going to sink today. The command vessel told them to prepare for final evacuation. All remaining personnel to the North Life Raft Station, extraction priority to injured personnel. They had 20 minutes before the weather window closed. A fast-moving front was tracking north. From the UntoldStoriesN, and the seas were already building to the east. Rafael checked the radio for the final count from command, 61 across all units. He checked again. 61. Connor. He kept his voice level. Command has 61 accounted for across all units. We're missing 2. Connor's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, something that moved quickly and then went still. The control room, top of the production module, access stairwell. He was already moving. It's sealed. Blast doors would have closed automatically in the overpressure event. If anyone made it in before the doors closed, they'd be protected, Rafael said, following. And trapped. Yes. Can we open it from outside? Not with standard tools. But there's a manual override port on the north face of the stairwell housing. Connor was already taking the stairs 2 at a time. I need a 12mm hex key. Rafael reached into his rescue kit, pulled out a heavy-duty multi-tool, extended the hex adapter. Connor looked at it, then at him. That works, he said. They took the stairs at a run. Chapter 2. Below the surface. The control room had 2 people in it. A junior engineer named Kelvin Marsh, 26 years old, and on only his second offshore rotation, who had made it through the blast door with 11 seconds to spare, and had spent the last 40 minutes trying to reach anyone on a radio that the explosion had partially fried. And Yolanda Faber, the platform's communications officer, who had stayed at her console through the initial explosion, attempting to transmit a full mayday with personnel count before the power failed, and had gotten through 1 full transmission and partial second before the system went down. They were both fine. Shaken, smoke-affected, the particular gray pale of people who had been very afraid for a sustained period and were managing the aftermath of adrenaline. But fine. Connor crouched in front of Kelvin for a moment, a gesture Rafael registered without being sure why. Not an inspection. Not a professional check. Something more like making sure the younger man could see his face clearly enough to know that it was over. You did the right thing, Connor said. Getting to the blast door, Kelvin nodded. His jaw was working. Yolanda's transmission went through, Connor continued. Full mayday with count. That transmission is part of why help came this fast. He glanced at Yolanda. Both of you did exactly right. They got them to the north muster station in 8 minutes. Rafael checked the final head count with command. 63. Every one of them. He had been doing this job for 11 years, and he had never lost a person on an active rescue. He had come close twice, and both times had carried the weight of the close call for longer than he talked about. Standing at the rail of a burning, listing platform in the Gulf of Mexico, with 63 people accounted for and a front coming in from the south, he felt the specific, complicated relief of a number that had come out right. He looked up. Connor James was standing at the far end of the muster group, doing his own count. His lips were moving. When he reached the end, he stopped. He stood very still for a moment. Then he looked up and found Rafael across the crowd. Rafael held his gaze, nodded once. Connor closed his eyes for half a second, opened them, nodded back. The evacuation took 19 minutes. 3 helicopters, priority sequencing, injured first the safety officer with the broken collarbone, 2 roughnecks with smoke inhalation, a driller who had taken a pressure injury to his left eardrum. Connor went in the 3rd lift, which was also Rafael's lift, which was not something either of them had arranged, and Rafael noticed it anyway. The flight back to Galveston was 37 minutes. Loud rotors, wind, the ambient noise of a working rescue helicopter, and close. 12 people in a cabin designed for 8, equipment stored wherever it fit. Connor was in the aft section, back against the fuselage wall, survival suit unzipped to the waist, staring at nothing in particular with the expression of someone processing an enormous amount of information at once. Rafael was 3 feet away because 3 feet was all there was. At some point, maybe 15 minutes out, Connor turned his head and looked at him. Not the calculating look from the catwalk, not the working look from inside the platform. Something with the calculation taken out of it, or taken down to a low enough setting that what was underneath could be seen. You knew I was an engineer, he said. From the way I described the anchor point. Yes. Most people don't notice that. I notice what people lead with, Rafael said. It tells you a lot. You described the failure mode before you described that you were scared. Connor was quiet for a moment. I wasn't scared. I know. Rafael looked at him. That's also information. Something moved across Connor's expression. Not quite a smile, but the muscular precursor to one. You always assess people this way? On extraction? Always. What else did you notice? The question was direct enough that Rafael took a moment with it. The answer was more than he would normally offer, more than the professional situation called for. But there was something about 37 minutes in a helicopter after 63 people had been counted and accounted for that made the normal rationing feel unnecessary. You talked to the kid Kelvin before you brought him to the rail, Rafael said. You didn't check him for injuries first. You looked at his face first. He paused. You wanted him to know it was over before he had to walk out of that room. Connor held his gaze. He was 26, Connor said. 2nd rotation. He looked toward the window. The Gulf below them, still moving, the smoke column from the Copernicus visible at the horizon, the color of something that had given up. I remember my 2nd rotation. I was terrified the whole time, and I didn't tell anyone because I didn't think I was allowed to be. Were you? Allowed to be terrified? Yes. A long pause. The rotors, the wind. I think everyone is. I just didn't know it then. He turned back from the window. The platform is going to be investigated. The overpressure event, the sequential failures, the blast door seals. All of it. Yes. My drilling program will be reviewed. His voice was still measured, but something underneath it was not. The well integrity protocols. The gas cap calibration procedures. He paused. I need to know, was it preventable? I need to sit down with the data and understand what happened and whether something I did or didn't do. Connor, Rafael said it quietly, not stopping him, just placing his name in the sentence like a marker. Connor stopped. You spent 23 minutes in a burning building finding 7 people that the evacuation missed, Rafael said. You used a structure you'd known for 6 weeks to navigate a rescue in smoke and fire. You took care of a 26-year-old before you took care of yourself. He paused. You can look at the data. You should look at the data. But right now, on this helicopter, you're allowed to have a different conversation. Connor looked at him for a long time. What conversation? He said. Whatever you want, Rafael said. We've got 20 minutes. Connor James had grown up in Baton Rouge. His father had worked the refineries on the Mississippi corridor, not as an engineer, as a pipefitter, and Connor had spent his childhood in the particular landscape of industrial Louisiana. The smell of petrochemical processing, the geometry of flare stacks against flat sky, the knowledge that the thing that put food on the table was also the thing that could kill you if you weren't paying attention. He had gone to SU on an engineering scholarship and spent 6 years becoming the kind of engineer his father's co-workers reported to, which was something he thought about without quite knowing what to do with. Does that feel strange? Rafael asked. That reversal? Yes, and also not. My father was proud. Connor paused. He died 2 years ago. Heart. He never missed a physical, never smoked, ran 3 miles every morning at 5 a.m. for 30 years. He looked at his hands. I don't know what to do with that math. The part where doing everything right isn't a guarantee. Yes. Rafael was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Gulf Coast was visible now, the thin line of Galveston Island, the industrial waterfront, the familiar shape of the air station. 20 minutes had become 5. My mother says I chose this job to punish myself for something, Rafael said. He wasn't sure why he said it. The same logic as the dark on the catwalk, probably. The altitude. The aftermath. She's from Monterey, very direct. She doesn't do subtlety. Is she right? I think she's half right. I think I chose it because going into bad situations and coming out with the person matters to me in a way that nothing else has. He paused. That's probably not a simple thing, no, Connor said. It's not. They looked at each other for a moment with the particular quality of 2 people who have stopped performing and are simply looking. The diner by the air station, Rafael said. A Spinoza's. It opens at 6. They know me there. Connor blinked. Recalibrating, visibly. It's barely 9 in the morning. We've been up since before 4. Time is relative. Rafael kept his voice level. Best coffee in Galveston. The eggs are good. I'm suggesting it. A pause. I have to give a statement to Incident Command, Connor said. After that. Another pause. Okay, Connor said. After that. The debrief took 2 hours. Rafael gave his statement. Extraction sequence, personnel count, structural assessments, timing. He was thorough and efficient, the way he had been trained to be. And the incident commander thanked him with the particular exhausted gratitude of someone who had been managing a crisis for 3 hours and was starting to see the end of it. He waited. He told himself he was doing paperwork. He was doing paperwork. At 10:47 a.m. Connor James came out of the operations building and walked across the parking lot with his survival suit bundled under one arm and the expression of someone who had answered every question truthfully and was now very tired and very hungry. He stopped in front of Rafael Espinosa's, he said. Yeah, Rafael said. You said the eggs were good. Best in Galveston. Connor looked at him. The Gulf light was direct and flat at this hour. The kind that showed you exactly what a face looked like without any softening. He had dark circles under his eyes and a small burn mark on his left jaw where something had caught him during the evacuation. He looked like someone who had been through something and was still in the mild shock of being on the other side of it. He also looked, in this light, like someone Rafael wanted to keep talking to. This was not a feeling he examined on the parking lot. He simply noted it and started walking. Connor fell into step beside him. Chapter 3. What we swim back to. Espinosa's was exactly what he'd described. A narrow diner 2 blocks from the air station entrance. Run by a woman named Carla, who had been feeding Coast Guard personnel for 23 years and knew Rafael's order before he sat down. 2 coffees arrived without being asked for. Connor wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at it for a moment before drinking. The way people looked at things that were warm after being cold. They talked. Not the way they'd talked in the helicopter. Not accounting for themselves. Not filling in the biographical gaps. Something easier than that. Rafael told a story about a rescue in 30-foot seas off Cape Hatteras that had gone wrong in 4 successive ways and then, inexplicably, right. Connor told a story about a well in the Permian Basin that had behaved so contrary to its reservoir model that the company had sent in 2 consulting teams, and neither of them had gotten it right. And Connor had eventually driven out himself and sat on the site for 6 hours watching the pressure data until he understood what it was telling him. What was it telling you? Rafael asked. That the model was built on an assumption that wasn't accurate. A small one. The permeability estimate for the middle formation. Everyone used the industry standard because that's what you did. But this formation was different in a way that only showed up in long-term pressure behavior, not in the initial well test. And you saw it by sitting with it. I saw it by refusing to accept that the data was wrong, Connor said. The data is never wrong. The model is wrong. The data is always telling you something true. You just have to figure out what the true thing is. Rafael looked at him. That's how I think about water. Connor tilted his head. Water? When I deploy, the water is always telling me something true. Current direction, temperature differential, where the surge is going. People fight the water, they try to overcome it. I don't. I read it, and I move with it. You read it the way I read reservoir data. Yes. Rafael held his gaze. Completely different medium. Same principle. Connor was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the gulf was visible between the buildings. Calm at this distance. Flat and bright in the morning light. Giving nothing away. 63, Connor said. Yes. I kept running the count in my head during the debrief. I knew it was 63. I knew everyone was accounted for. I kept running it anyway. That's normal, Rafael said. After a close one, your brain runs it on a loop for a while. It's checking. Checking for what? For the version where the count was different. Rafael set down his coffee. You run it enough times with the right number, and eventually it accepts the answer. Connor looked at him with an expression that had been building since the helicopter, since the parking lot, since the moment in the control room doorway when Rafael had waited while he crouched down to Kelvin's level. An expression of someone who was used to processing alone and had encountered, unexpectedly, a situation in which processing alone seemed like the wrong approach. Does it always work? Connor asked. The loop. Not always. But usually. Rafael paused. It helps to have something to anchor it. Something outside the loop. The silence between them had a different quality now than it had on the helicopter. There was no noise requiring them to lean close. No mechanical reason for proximity. This was just the two of them at a diner table. Coffee cups between them. The morning light on Connor's face making the burn mark on his jaw look smaller than it had in the parking lot. You don't know me, Connor said. Not a challenge. A statement of fact, offered carefully. I know what you did for 4 hours this morning, Rafael said. That's a version of knowing someone. He paused. And you came to breakfast. You suggested breakfast. You said okay. Connor looked down at his coffee cup. When he looked up, the expression was there, fully unmanaged, uncontained. The thing that had been pressing against the professional surface since the helicopter, and had finally found a moment quiet enough to show itself. I've been offshore for 6 weeks, he said. Before that, 8 weeks in Aberdeen. Before that, a stint in Jakarta that lasted for months. He said it without self-pity. Just the geography of a life. I'm very good at my job, and I'm not very good at being anywhere long enough to. He stopped. To what? A pause. To have breakfast with someone, he said. Rafael held his gaze. You're having breakfast with someone. I know. The edge of something that might have been a smile. I'm noticing that. Carl arrived with eggs and toast and 2 more coffees and left with the efficient discretion of someone who had been running a diner near a Coast Guard station for 23 years and had developed a comprehensive understanding of what people looked like when they needed to be left alone. They ate. They talked. The morning moved around them, other tables filling, the sound of the street outside, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday in Galveston. The crisis was somewhere behind them, being documented and investigated and managed by the institutional apparatus that existed for that purpose. They were in a diner. The eggs were, as advertised, excellent. At some point, Rafael told Connor about Monterey, about his mother, who was 71 and still sent him food through the mail, a logistical achievement that he had never fully understood, and who called every Sunday at exactly a.m. because she had decided that Sunday a.m. was the time most likely to find him alive and available. He told him about the year he'd almost left the Coast Guard, 3 years in, when the cumulative weight of what the job asked got heavy enough that he'd sat down with his commander and said he didn't know if he could keep doing it. "What did your commander say?" Connor asked. "She said that the ones who asked the question were the ones she wanted to keep." Rafael looked out the window. "She said the ones who never asked it scared her." Connor was quiet. "I've never asked it," he said. "About my job? No. I've asked other questions. Whether I was in the right place. Whether I was spending my time on the right things. But not whether I should keep doing the work." He paused. The work always made sense. Everything around it was harder to calibrate. What's around it? A long pause. The Gulf light moved on the table between them. "Everything else," Connor said. "The part that isn't the platform. The part I've been postponing." Rafael didn't look away. "Is that what you've been doing?" "Think so." Connor met his eyes. "I'm not sure I knew what I was postponing it for." The sentence landed in the quiet between them and stayed there. Rafael reached across the table. He didn't think about it. It was the same instinct that put him in the water before he'd finished calculating the risk. The same reflex that said go before the rational assessment was complete. He put his hand on the table, palm up, not reaching for Connor's hand, just placing it there. Connor looked at it, then at Rafael, then he put his hand in Rafael's. His grip was warm and careful, the grip of someone who understood load-bearing, who knew the difference between holding something and straining it. He held on the same way he'd held the rail of the catwalk, deliberately, consciously, with full commitment to the decision. Other of them spoke. Outside, a pelican landed on the seawall across the street and arranged itself with the ancient, unbothered dignity of something that had been doing this exact thing in this exact place for longer than the city had existed. The Gulf rolled against the shore beneath it. The morning kept going. "I'm in Galveston for 2 more weeks, Rafael said, "while the investigation is ongoing. Liam is attached to incident support." Connor looked at him. "And after?" "Back to the air station. I'm based here." A pause. "You?" "The company has a field office in Houston. I'll be there for the investigation." He paused. "Houston is 45 minutes from here." "It is," Rafael said. "I know how to drive 45 minutes, Connor said. "I've driven a lot farther for things that mattered less." Rafael looked at him across the table, across the coffee cups and the eggs and the Tuesday morning, and the ordinary miracle of a number that had come out right. He thought about 11 years in the water, about the things he'd swum toward and the things he'd swum back to, and the way he'd never quite been able to explain to his mother that the reason he kept going out was also the reason he kept coming back. The data was never wrong, Connor had said. The data is always telling you something. True. You just have to figure out what the true thing is. Good, Rafael said. He didn't let go of Connor's hand. "I'll make sure Carla knows you're coming." Connor's expression did what it had been doing all morning. Shifted, opened, let something through that the professional surface had been too busy to show. He laughed. Actually laughed, quiet and genuine, in the specific register of relief becoming something lighter. "The eggs really are good," he said. "Told you," Rafael said. They stayed until the coffee was gone, which took a while. Carla refilled it twice without being asked. The pelican on the seawall stayed where it was, facing the Gulf, steady on its perch in the Galveston morning, in no apparent hurry to go anywhere. The platform was out there somewhere. The investigation would begin. The data would be reviewed, the models reconstructed, the sequential failures walked backward to their origin. Connor would sit with it for as long as it took. That was who he was. And Rafael had known it from the moment he'd heard him describe the anchor point on the catwalk. Calm as a calculation, in a situation that would have unmade most people, he had read the data. He had figured out the true thing. He was in no apparent hurry to let go.